The cruelest revenge is not hatred spoken aloud, but a silence so polite it teaches the innocent to disappear. Clara Whitmore stood in the west chamber of Blackwood Manor with rain pressing against the windows and an open traveling trunk at her feet. For 3 years, she had lived beneath the roof of Duke Adrian Blackwood as his wife in title and his stranger in every other way. The room around her was beautiful in the manner of old houses that had learned to keep secrets: dark walnut panels, a narrow bed dressed in ivory linen, a dying fire, and silver candlesticks throwing thin light across the floor. She folded the last of her gowns with careful hands. Not hurried. Not trembling. A woman may break loudly when she still hopes to be heard. Clara had passed beyond that. On the table beside her lay the small wedding Bible she had carried from Whitmore Hall on the morning of her marriage, its leather cover worn soft at the corners, its pages untouched by comfort. She had once believed it would bless a beginning. Instead, it had watched the slow education of loneliness. Duke Adrian had given her his name, his protection, and the cold courtesy of a man determined never to forget why he had married her. He never raised his voice. He never shamed her before guests. He never denied her jewels, gowns, or a place at the head of his table. He simply did not look at her. Not at dinner. Not in the chapel. Not when she entered a room wearing the pearls chosen by his own steward. His indifference was so perfect that society called it dignity. Clara called it winter. She lifted the Bible from the table, intending to place it inside the trunk, when something slipped from between its pages and fell to the carpet. A letter. Old cream paper, folded twice, sealed long ago and broken by time, the ink faded but legible beneath the candlelight. Clara stared at it, a strange cold moving through her. She had never seen it before. Before she could reach for it, the chamber door opened. Adrian stood on the threshold in a dark evening coat, rain shining on his shoulders as though he had come in from the storm without noticing it. He had meant, perhaps, to ask why her maid was packing, or to tell her that leaving without permission would embarrass the Blackwood name. But his eyes dropped to the letter on the floor, and all color left his face. There, written across the front in a hand he knew better than his own, was the name that had haunted every corridor of his life: Lady Eleanor Blackwood. Clara saw the change in him and understood, with the sharp instinct of a woman accustomed to surviving silence, that this letter belonged to the wound he had used as a weapon against her. Adrian crossed the room slowly. For the first time in 3 years, he looked not past her, not through her, but at the fragile paper between them as if it had risen from a grave to speak. "Where did you get this?" His voice was low, controlled, but something beneath it had begun to fracture. Clara did not step back. "I did not know it existed." He bent and picked up the letter with fingers that were no longer steady. The fire cracked softly. Rain threaded the glass. Outside, Blackwood Manor remained as grand and silent as ever, but inside that chamber, the revenge he had built his marriage upon had just found its first witness. Adrian did not open the letter at once. He stood in Clara's west chamber with the old paper in his hand, and for a moment the room seemed to pull him backward through 3 years of deliberate coldness. The rain tapped against the windows with a soft persistence, as if the storm itself had come to listen. Clara remained beside the open trunk, still as a figure carved from candlelight, her fair face composed, her hands folded before her grey traveling dress. She did not ask him to read it. She did not plead innocence. That silence unsettled him more than any defense could have done, because Clara had learned silence from him. He had given it to her every morning, every evening, every season of their marriage, until she wore it with the same quiet dignity as her wedding ring. 3 years earlier, in the chapel of St. Bartholomew, she had walked toward him through winter light with white flowers in her gloved hands and a veil softening the fear she had tried to hide. Adrian remembered every detail with cruel accuracy, though he had pretended for years to remember nothing. The old stone chapel had smelled of beeswax and wet wool. Society had filled the pews, eager to witness the union between the fallen Whitmore family and the powerful Blackwood name. Clara had been 21, pale from sleeplessness but steady, her dark hair pinned beneath pearls that had once belonged to her mother. When she reached him at the altar, she lifted her eyes only once. There had been no arrogance in them. No triumph. Only a fragile courage that should have stopped him. It did not. In his heart, he had already made her a symbol before she had spoken a vow. A Whitmore. The name tasted of ruin to him. It had been whispered beside his sister Eleanor's closed bedroom door, written in letters his mother had burned, spoken by servants who fell silent whenever he entered. Eleanor, gentle Eleanor, had returned from one terrible season at Whitmore Hall changed beyond recognition, her laughter folded away, her music abandoned, her life narrowed to shadows and locked rooms. Adrian had been told enough to hate and not enough to understand. Lord Victor Whitmore, Clara's cousin, had stood at the center of every account, but Adrian's grief had been too hungry for precision. It had devoured the whole family name. So when Whitmore debts rose like floodwater and Victor offered Clara's hand a settlement, Adrian accepted with a revenge so civilized that no one dared call it cruelty. He would not shout. He would not strike. He would not drag the Whitmores through public scandal. He would marry their gentlest daughter and let her live inside the same elegant coldness Eleanor had been forced to carry. That was what he had told himself. Justice. Balance. Honor restored without ugliness. On their wedding morning, Clara had placed her hand in his, and he had felt how cold her fingers were. He had not warmed them. After the ceremony, guests waited for him to kiss her hand. He bowed instead. Deeply. Perfectly. Without tenderness. Clara's lashes lowered. A few women noticed. The first wound of their marriage was delivered with such flawless manners that no one could accuse him of anything at all. In the months that followed, he perfected absence. Breakfast came and went without him. Dinners were taken in separate rooms unless guests required display. When Clara entered the library, he found business elsewhere. When she spoke of repairs to the village chapel, he signed the papers without looking up. When illness kept her in bed one winter, he sent the physician and a note in his secretary's hand. He never asked what loneliness sounded like inside the rooms he had given her. He believed he was punishing a name. Now, holding Eleanor's letter while Clara's trunk stood open between them, Adrian felt the first tremor of a terrible possibility. Perhaps he had not punished a name. Perhaps he had punished a woman who had been given to him already wounded, and had spent 3 years bleeding where no one could see. Clara had not been born into strength. She had learned it the way one learns to walk through a dark house, by touching the walls, by remembering where the stairs begin, by refusing to fall loudly enough for anyone cruel to take satisfaction in it. Before she became Duchess of Blackwood, she had been the quiet daughter of the Whitmore line, raised among fading portraits, unpaid bills, and rooms where beauty was preserved long after comfort had vanished. Whitmore Hall still looked noble from the road, with its white columns and long lawns, but inside, carpets had worn thin, silver had disappeared piece by piece, and fires were lit only when guests might notice the cold. Her mother had died when Clara was 16, leaving behind a small prayer book, a pearl comb, and the instruction to remain kind without becoming anyone's fool. Clara had tried. She had cared for her younger sister, Rose, soothed creditors with letters written in her late father's name, and endured Lord Victor Whitmore's growing authority over the estate with a calm that concealed how little choice she truly had. Victor was her cousin, polished and handsome in the way rotten fruit may still shine beneath candlelight. He spoke of family duty whenever he meant obedience. He spoke of sacrifice whenever he meant Clara. When the Blackwood proposal came, he presented it not as a bargain but as salvation. "You should be grateful," he told her in the old breakfast room while rain ran down the cracked window panes. "A duke's protection is more than a girl in your position could hope for." Clara had known at once that something lay beneath the arrangement. Duke Adrian Blackwood had never looked upon her with admiration at any assembly. He had never written, never called, never shown the smallest warmth toward her family. Men did not offer marriage to ruined houses without wanting something hidden inside the walls. Yet Victor's smile hardened when she hesitated. "Rose cannot live on sentiment," he said. "Nor can this estate. Refuse him, and I sell the last cottage your mother left in trust. I doubt your sister will enjoy being dependent on distant charity." That was how Clara entered the marriage, not with dreams, but with a younger sister's future held against her throat like a ribbon drawn too tight. She did not know then that Victor had already buried deeper truths. She did not know that a letter addressed to her had once arrived at Whitmore Hall in Eleanor Blackwood's hand. She did not know that the letter had vanished before she ever saw it, tucked away by the man who needed silence more than innocence. All Clara knew was that on the night before her wedding, she found Rose asleep beside the nursery fire, clutching the hem of Clara's gown, whispering that everything would be all right if they were together again by spring. Clara promised it would be. She had lied gently, which is sometimes the only kindness left to the powerless. After the wedding, Blackwood Manor received her with a grandeur that felt less like welcome than custody. The ceilings were high, the corridors long, the windows tall enough to show the winter sky in full indifference. Adrian's staff bowed to her. His steward placed keys in her hand. His housekeeper addressed her as Your Grace with perfect respect. Yet the house itself seemed to understand what its master had decided. Clara was to be installed, honored, and emotionally starved. In the first weeks, she tried to make herself useful. She learned which servants had aching joints, which tenants were behind because of failed crops, which windows leaked in the north wing, which chapel pews had cracked beneath years of damp. She sent soup to old Mrs. Bell when fever kept the housekeeper in bed. She arranged for Rose to receive books and warm clothes without letting Victor know where the money came from. She restored small mercies wherever she could, as if kindness were a candle she might carry from room to room against the dark. Adrian noticed none of it, or appeared not to. At dinner, when obligation forced him to sit across from her, his eyes remained on the silverware, the wineglass, the mantel clock, anywhere but her face. When she asked about Eleanor once, softly, carefully, the room froze. "Do not speak my sister's name," he said. No anger. No raised voice. Only a door slammed without sound. Clara never asked again. But every year on the anniversary no one explained, she placed white flowers beneath Eleanor's portrait in the East Hall. She did not know whether Eleanor had loved roses, lilies, or violets. She only knew that a woman remembered only through grief deserved beauty without accusation. Unseen from the staircase shadows, Adrian watched her once, and hatred faltered for a heartbeat before pride taught it to stand again. The first year of Clara's marriage passed like a candle burning behind thick glass. There was light, but no warmth. Blackwood Manor continued to function with impressive precision. Meals arrived on silver trays, horses were groomed before dawn, fires were laid in rooms no one entered, and invitations from neighboring estates were answered in Clara's careful hand. Society saw a dignified young duchess and a powerful duke whose grief had made him reserved. No one saw the hours between appearances, when Clara sat alone in the long dining room while the chair opposite her remained empty, or the mornings when she crossed the gallery and felt Adrian's presence vanish through another door before she reached it. He was never openly cruel. That was what made the loneliness so difficult to name. Cruelty, if loud enough, earns witnesses. Adrian's was made of polished manners, sealed notes, unanswered questions, and a silence so refined it looked almost like respect. Clara learned the geography of his absence. The library after breakfast. The study before dinner. The east terrace when rain fell. The chapel only on Eleanor's anniversary, when the house itself seemed to lower its voice. She learned not to ask whether he would dine. She learned not to pause when footsteps approached from behind. She learned not to turn hope into a habit, because hope, neglected daily, becomes a quieter form of humiliation. Yet she did not become bitter. There were children in the village who needed coats. There was a nursery wing at Blackwood Manor long closed after Eleanor's sorrow, its shutters grey with dust and its shelves still holding toys no child had touched in years. Clara asked the housekeeper for permission to reopen it on winter afternoons for the tenants' children whose mothers worked in the laundry and kitchens. Mrs. Bell looked startled by the request, then softened. "His Grace may not approve." Clara touched the brass key in her palm. "Then tell him it was my fault." For 2 months, laughter returned quietly to the north side of the house. Small boots crossed old carpets. Thin hands warmed around mugs of cider. Clara read stories beside the fire, her voice low and steady, while the children leaned against cushions that had once belonged to a family too wounded to use them. Adrian discovered it by accident on a snow-heavy afternoon. He had returned early from the stables and heard a sound so unfamiliar in Blackwood Manor that he stopped at the foot of the stairs. Laughter. Not mocking. Not careless. Pure, sudden, alive. He followed it to the nursery doorway and found Clara kneeling beside a little girl with tangled hair, tying a ribbon around a cracked wooden doll. The child smiled at her as though a duchess could be a miracle if she only sat low enough to be reached. Clara's face, usually composed in his presence, was different there. Softer. Warm with unguarded tenderness. For one dangerous instant, Adrian saw not a Whitmore, not revenge, not a symbol of old pain, but a woman holding gentleness in a house he had allowed to become a mausoleum. The sight angered him because it moved him. He stepped back before she saw him and told himself that kindness could also be a performance. That night, he sent a note through his steward approving the continued use of the nursery on condition that household order not be disturbed. Clara received the note after dinner, alone, and read it twice. No compliment. No acknowledgement. No signature beyond his formal hand. Still, she folded it carefully and placed it in the drawer beside her mother's prayer book. A lesser heart might have hated him for giving permission where gratitude was due. Clara only whispered, "Thank you," to an empty room, because she had not yet learned that some men will accept a woman's light while still refusing to admit they were living in darkness. By the second winter, the manor had begun to change in ways too quiet for gossip and too persistent for Adrian to ignore. Fresh linen appeared in the unused guest rooms when travelers were stranded by snow. The cracked chapel windows were repaired before Christmas. A basket of wool scarves sat near the servants' entrance, each one marked for a child who had arrived at the nursery with bare wrists and blue fingers. The accounts showed no extravagance. Clara never wasted money on display. She simply redirected comfort toward the places where cold had been accepted too long. Adrian signed the ledgers and told himself efficiency pleased him. Yet efficiency did not explain why Mrs. Bell smiled more often, why old footman Harris no longer climbed the east stairs with visible pain because Clara had quietly assigned a younger boy to help him, or why the portrait of Eleanor in the East Hall was dusted every morning and set with white flowers on Fridays. No one had ordered that. No one but Clara would have thought grief deserved freshness. One afternoon, Adrian returned from the village during a hard rain and found the stable yard in disorder. A leak had opened in the roof of the old archive shed, where boxes from Whitmore Hall had been stored since Clara's marriage. Servants hurried beneath canvas, carrying ledgers, letters, and wrapped portraits toward the manor before the damp ruined them. Adrian stepped from his carriage ready to give orders, but stopped when he saw Clara in the rain. She stood beside the shed door in a dark cloak, her skirts wet at the hem, passing boxes to the servants with steady urgency. "Your Grace," Mrs. Bell called from the steps, "please come inside. You will take cold." Clara shook her head. "These belong to families before they belong to storage. Bring the smaller trunks first." Adrian watched as she bent to lift a narrow wooden box from the mud. A servant reached to take it from her, but she held it a moment longer, wiping rain from the brass nameplate with her thumb. Eleanor Blackwood. The sight struck Adrian still. Clara's face changed when she read the name. Not with guilt. Not fear. With sorrow. She held the box as carefully as one might hold a sleeping child and said, almost too softly to hear over the rain, "No woman deserves to be remembered only by sorrow." The words entered him before pride could stop them. He had spent years guarding Eleanor's memory like a locked room, believing reverence meant keeping the curtains drawn and every question unanswered. Clara, who had every reason to resent the ghost between them, had spoken of his sister not as a wound, but as a woman. That night, Adrian could not settle. He stood outside the open door of the blue drawing room, where Clara sat near the fire with Eleanor's water-damaged letters spread across a table to dry. She did not know he was there. Her hair was loosened from the rain, her face pale with fatigue, yet she handled each page with patient tenderness. When one sheet began to tear at the edge, she paused as if the paper itself felt pain. "Careful," she whispered, though no one was beside her. Adrian should have entered then. He should have asked why she cared. He should have said his sister's name without letting hatred answer first. Instead, he remained in the corridor, a man too proud to step into the mercy he had been secretly receiving. The next morning, he found a small note on his desk in Clara's hand. "The letters from the archive are safe. Some are badly damaged, but I will continue drying them if your grace permits. There may be things worth preserving." He read the final sentence 3 times. There may be things worth preserving. Beneath it, for the first time in their marriage, Clara had signed only her name. Not Duchess of Blackwood. Not your obedient wife. Clara. The simplicity of it unsettled him. It sounded less like a signature than a person standing at the threshold of being seen. He dipped his pen, intending to reply with formal permission. The words would not come. Outside, rain slid down the study windows, and in its reflection he saw himself clearly enough to be ashamed, a man who had married for revenge, then grown afraid that kindness might prove his revenge unjust. When he finally answered, he wrote only, "Preserve what you think should be preserved." He stared at the sentence, then added, "Thank you." It was the first gratitude he had ever given her in his own hand. Clara received the note in the blue drawing room and pressed it lightly between the pages of her mother's prayer book. She did not smile. She had learned not to build hope upon one warm coal in a house full of ashes. But she kept the note. Even then, some part of her still wanted to believe that the winter in him might someday break. By the 3rd spring, Adrian had begun to understand that suspicion can survive even when hatred grows tired. He no longer believed Clara cruel. That admission had come first, reluctantly, like dawn entering a room through a crack in the shutters. Then came the harder truth: he had begun to look for her. Not openly. Not with the honesty she deserved. He looked for the pale gray of her gown at the end of the breakfast hall, for her handwriting on household notes, for the sound of her voice in the nursery where children had learned to laugh beneath Blackwood ceilings. He told himself it was concern for the estate. He told himself gratitude required attention. He did not yet possess the courage to call it longing. Clara, meanwhile, had learned the dangerous art of expecting less. She no longer waited for his footsteps outside her chamber. She no longer paused in the gallery hoping he might speak. She accepted his brief notes of approval with the same composed thanks she gave the steward. When he entered a room, she rose, curtsied, and continued whatever useful work had occupied her hands. This calm unnerved him more than tears would have done. Tears might have accused. Calm suggested release. On an afternoon washed clean by rain, Adrian found her in the chapel, kneeling not in prayer, but beside a loosened floorboard near the altar. A small wooden chest sat open beside her, filled with old ribbons, candles, and faded memorial cards saved from years when grief had been stored wherever there was space enough to hide it. "The damp has reached this side again," Clara said without turning, as though his presence no longer had the power to startle her. "If we do not repair the foundation before summer storms, the floor may warp." He looked at the white flowers beneath Eleanor's portrait, fresh as always. "You still bring them?" Clara's hand stilled over the chest. "Yes." "Why?" It was the first time he had asked without accusation. She looked back at him then, and the chapel light softened the tiredness around her eyes. "Because she was your sister. Because whatever happened, she must have been more than the pain left behind. Because I know what it is to be spoken of as a reason for sorrow and not as a person." Adrian felt the sentence enter him carefully and stay there. "You believe I have done that to you?" Clara rose, smoothing dust from her skirt. "I believe you married me to answer a grief I did not understand. I believe I became useful to your anger before I was ever allowed to become real to you." No raised voice. No bitterness dressed for battle. Just truth, plain and devastating in the chapel air. He wanted to deny it. He could not. "Clara," he said, and her name sounded unfamiliar because he had used it so rarely. Her eyes lowered for one brief second, not from shyness, but from the weight of hearing what should have been ordinary. Before either could speak again, Mrs. Bell appeared at the chapel door, holding a stack of damp papers wrapped in linen. "Your Grace," she said to Clara first, then startled and bowed to Adrian. "Forgive me." More items from the Whitmore trunks were found in the lower storehouse. "I thought Her Grace should see them before they are sent to be dried." Adrian's gaze sharpened at the name Whitmore, but the old reflex did not rise as cleanly as before. Clara took the bundle with gentle hands. "Thank you, Mrs. Bell. I will look through them tonight." That night, she sat alone in the west chamber, sorting through warped account books, family notices, and yellowed invitations that smelled of mildew and cedar. Adrian remained in his study 2 corridors away, unable to read, unable to escape the sentence she had given him in the chapel. "Useful to your anger." Near midnight, a servant passed his door carrying a candle and whispered to another that Her Grace had asked for her traveling trunk to be taken down from the attic. Adrian stood so suddenly his chair scraped the floor. He went to the west chamber without knowing what he meant to say. Clara was not crying when he arrived. That was almost worse. Her trunk stood open at the foot of the bed. The wedding Bible lay on the table. The damp papers were spread around it like fragments of a life about to be gathered and left behind. "You are leaving," he said. Clara folded a shawl with careful precision. "Yes." The single word carried no threat. No plea. Only the quiet sound of a door no longer asking permission to close. Adrian took one step into the room, and that was when the Bible shifted beneath the corner of a warped ledger. A sealed letter slipped from between its pages and fell to the carpet, landing face up in the candlelight. Eleanor Blackwood's name stared back at him, and the silence that followed did not feel empty. It felt like judgment had finally learned to speak. Adrian picked up the letter as though it might burn through his hand. The seal had broken with age, not force, and the paper trembled faintly between his fingers in the draught from the rain-dark window. Clara watched him from beside the open trunk, her shawl still unfolded in her hands, her face pale beneath the candlelight. She did not understand why Eleanor's name had been hidden in her wedding Bible. She did not understand why the sight of that faded handwriting had turned Adrian from a distant man into someone standing at the edge of ruin. "Open it," she said quietly. Adrian looked at her. For 3 years, he had denied her the dignity of answers, yet now the only door left between them could not be opened unless she permitted it. The shame of that nearly stopped his breath. He unfolded the letter. The first line was addressed not to him, but to Clara. "My dear Miss Whitmore, if this reaches you, then I have no one else left who may listen without turning away." Adrian's jaw tightened. Clara drew one slow breath. Eleanor had written to her. Not to Victor. Not to Adrian. To her. He continued reading, each sentence stripping away another piece of the story he had built his life around. Eleanor wrote of Whitmore Hall during the season that destroyed her name. She wrote not of Clara's cruelty, but of Clara's kindness, a younger girl who had brought her tea when others mocked her silence, who had found her crying in the old music room and sat beside her without asking for details, who had urged her to send word to Adrian before Lord Victor could twist the truth. Then came the line that made Adrian close his eyes. "If anything happens to me, do not blame Clara. She was the only one who tried to save me." The chapel clock in the distance struck once. Clara did not move. Adrian read the words again, as if repetition might make them less devastating. It did not. The letter revealed what grief and pride had refused to seek. Victor had intercepted Eleanor's earlier notes, had used her fear to protect his own reputation, had allowed whispers to gather around the Blackwood name while Clara, too young and too powerless, had tried to carry warnings through closed doors. Eleanor had known it. Eleanor had written the truth. And somehow, that truth had been buried inside the Bible Clara carried into a marriage built to punish her. "I never saw this," Clara whispered. Adrian heard no defense in her voice. Only stunned sorrow. "I believe you," he said. The words came rough, almost unfamiliar. How little he had given her, that belief now sounded like a gift arriving after the house had burned. Clara's fingers closed around the shawl. Then Victor hid it. Adrian looked down at the letter again. The name that had fed his hatred for years appeared in Eleanor's writing with quiet terror, not scandalous accusation, but enough. Enough to unmake him. "I married you because I thought your family had stolen my sister's peace," he said, each word measured and terrible. "And all this time, you were the one person in that house who tried to preserve it." Clara turned away then, not dramatically, but because the room had become too full of things neither of them could yet survive facing. Her trunk stood open like an answer. Adrian saw the folded gowns, the prayer book, the small packet of letters from her sister Rose, the life she had packed because his repentance had come only when evidence forced it. "Clara," he said. She looked back, and the quiet in her eyes was worse than anger. "No," she said softly. "Do not say my name as if it can repair what you refuse to see." He bowed his head. She was right. The letter had not saved him. It had accused him. It had taken a dead woman's handwriting to make him believe a living woman's goodness. In the corridor beyond the chamber, rainwater ticked from his coat onto the stone floor. Blackwood Manor seemed to hold its breath, waiting to discover whether truth would become another weapon or the first honest thing ever placed between them. Adrian folded the letter with great care and held it out to Clara. "This belongs to you." Clara did not take it immediately. "No," she said at last. "It belongs to Eleanor. And perhaps to the truth you should have looked for before making me pay for its absence." Her words entered him cleanly. No cruelty. No exaggeration. Only justice. At last, she accepted the letter, placed it beside the wedding Bible, and closed the lid of her trunk. The sound was soft, but to Adrian it carried the weight of a verdict. Clara left the West Chamber before dawn, not because she wished to escape like someone guilty, but because the manor had taught her that departures were safest when they did not ask permission from closed hearts. Mrs. Bell met her in the corridor with red eyes and a traveling cloak warmed by the kitchen fire. No questions passed between them. The old housekeeper only pressed Clara's hand once, the kind of gesture that carried more loyalty than a dozen vows spoken in public. The letter from Eleanor rested inside Clara's reticule beside her mother's prayer book. It felt heavier than paper. It was proof, yes, but proof had arrived late, and lateness has its own cruelty. Behind her, Blackwood Manor remained grand and sleeping, its tall windows dark, its stone face washed clean by rain it did not deserve. Clara looked back only once. She had entered that house as a bride offered in settlement, lived inside it as a punishment meant for another man's sin, and now walked away as the only person who had not mistaken silence for justice. By the time Adrian discovered she had gone, the sky had turned the color of pewter. Her trunk was gone. The West Chamber had been stripped of her quiet presence. On the table, she had left the note he had written months earlier, the one containing his first thank you. It lay beside a single white flower from Eleanor's portrait, its stem wrapped in thread. Adrian stood over it for a long time. That was when he understood that regret could be selfish if it only wept over what it had lost. Clara did not need his sorrow. She needed truth returned to its proper place. Before noon, Adrian rode to Whitmore Hall. He went without announcement, without ceremony, without the grand rage that would have made him feel righteous and therefore less guilty. The old estate looked as Clara had once described it without meaning to, beautiful from a distance, hollow when entered. Lord Victor Whitmore received him in the drawing-room with practiced charm, standing beside a marble fireplace where no fire had been lit. "Blackwood," Victor said, smiling as though the past were a social inconvenience. "What an unexpected honor." Adrian placed Eleanor's copied words on the table between them. Not the original. Clara had kept that. She had earned the right to decide who touched it. "You hid her letter." Victor's smile faded by the smallest degree. "I do not know what you mean." "You hid Eleanor's letter. You let my family believe Clara had been silent. You let me marry her in anger because it served you." Victor moved toward the decanter, but Adrian's voice stopped him. Do not perform confront. The room went still. No violence entered it. None was needed. Truth has a colder edge when spoken by a man who no longer needs fury to stand upright. Victor looked at the paper, then out toward the dead garden beyond the window. You wanted someone to blame, he said at last. I merely allowed you the convenience. Adrian felt the sentence settle into him like ash. There it was, the rot beneath the polish, the casual cruelty that had shaped 3 years of Clara's life. You will sign over the cottage left in trust to Rose Whitmore, Adrian said. You will return every income withheld from Clara's portion. You will provide a written account of Eleanor's letters and your interference. If you refuse, I will bring the matter before every family whose respect you have purchased with silence. Victor laughed once, thinly. And expose your own foolishness? Yes. The answer surprised them both. Adrian had spent years protecting his pride. Now it seemed a small and ugly thing beside Clara's name. I will expose my foolishness before I allow her innocence to remain hidden. By evening, the first documents were signed. By nightfall, messengers carried letters toward London, Briar Glen, and the families who had once whispered around Eleanor's sorrow. Adrian returned to Blackwood Manor soaked by rain and hollowed by the knowledge that correction was not atonement. It was merely the beginning of honesty. He found the chapel lit. Clara had not gone far. She stood before Eleanor's portrait with her cloak still on, the letter in her gloved hand, the white flowers glowing faintly beneath the candles. Adrian stopped at the entrance and did not cross the threshold. For once, he understood that every step toward her required permission he had not yet earned. Clara turned when she heard Adrian's footsteps stop at the chapel door. Candlelight lay between them in long gold lines, trembling over the stone floor, over Eleanor's portrait, over the letter that had arrived 3 years too late to protect the living from the damage of the dead. Adrian stood without crossing the threshold, his dark coat still damp from rain, his pale face stripped of the cold certainty that had once made him seem carved from Blackwood stone. For a long moment, he said nothing. Clara was grateful. She had endured enough words from men who used them to arrange the world in their favor. At last, Adrian lowered his head. Victor has signed the first papers. Rose's cottage is restored to her trust. Your withheld portion will be returned. By tomorrow, the families who heard the old rumors will receive the truth in my own hand. Clara looked at him steadily. That is justice for what was taken. Not for what I did. The answer was quiet, immediate, and without defense. He stepped only as far as the first pew, then stopped again. I married you to punish a ghost. Instead, I made a living woman suffer in silence. The words entered the chapel and remained there, plain and terrible. Clara's fingers closed around Eleanor's letter. She had imagined, in weaker hours, what it might feel like to hear him admit the truth. She had thought perhaps it would free something inside her. Instead, it only revealed how tired she was. I did not ask you to love me, she said. I only wished you would stop punishing me for a wound I did not make. Adrian closed his eyes. When he opened them, grief stood in his face without pride to dress it. I know. No, Clara said softly. You know because a letter told you. You did not know because you looked. That struck him more deeply than anger would have. He bowed his head again, accepting the wound because it was deserved. Outside, rain softened against the chapel windows, no longer a storm, only a steady washing of the dark. Then I will spend whatever time I am given learning to look, he said. Not asking you to stay. Not asking you to forgive me because remorse has finally made me honest. Only repairing what can be repaired, and leaving you free where I once left you lonely. Clara looked at Eleanor's portrait. The painted young woman seemed less imprisoned by sorrow beneath the fresh flowers. Perhaps truth had opened a window in the room where grief had been kept too long. I am leaving Blackwood Manor, Clara said. Adrian's breath changed, but he did not protest. Where will you go? To Rose for a time. Then perhaps to the cottage my mother loved. I need to remember who I was before this house taught me to move quietly. "May I write to you?" he asked. The question surprised her because it was small. Not a demand. Not an apology dressed as command. A request. Clara considered it while the candles burned lower. "One letter each day," she said at last. "Not promises. Not poetry. The truth. What you repaired. Who you wronged. What you learned when no one praised you for learning it." Adrian's hand tightened on the back of the pew. "And if you never answer? Then you will finally understand something about waiting." He accepted that too. In the months that followed, Blackwood Manor changed not by miracle, but by discipline. Victor's lies were answered publicly. Eleanor's name was released from whispers and remembered with gentleness. The nursery remained open. The chapel foundation was repaired. Rosa's cottage filled with lamplight again. Every evening, no matter where Adrian was, a letter left his desk addressed to Clara, not Duchess, not wife, not possession, but Clara. Some letters were clumsy. Some were brief. Some carried confessions that cost him sleep. Clara read them beside her mother's window, keeping only those that spoke with humility rather than hunger. She did not return quickly. A heart trained to survive cold must learn warmth slowly, or it will mistake heat for danger. When spring came, she visited Blackwood Chapel once more. Adrian was there alone, replacing wilted flowers beneath Eleanor's portrait. He turned at the sound of her step, but did not move toward her until she nodded. That small permission was the first mercy she offered him. He did not take her hand. He did not speak of love. He only stood beside her in the quiet and let truth be enough for the moment. Some hearts are not won back by regret, nor healed by a single letter found in time. They are restored, if they are restored at all, by the patient courage to repair what pride once destroyed.